Hello and welcome to the Diversity of Life 1 lab video. In the video today, we're going to be looking at the concept of taxonomy, which is how we name organisms. And we're also going to be looking at organisms in the domain bacteria, the domain archaea, the domain eukarya. And in the domain eukarya, we're going to be looking at organisms in the kingdom fungi and the kingdom plantae. But before we get into any of that, we need to talk a little bit about classifying living things. So let's use an example that most people at least have a passing understanding with. And we're going to use this to show that humans just generally tend to classify things in order to organize them and allow us to look at relationships between them. And the example I'm going to use is sports. Okay, if you were to think about the different types of sports that are out there, there's lots of different types. Okay, we could, in general, classify sports as those that use a ball and those that don't. Now, within each of those, so say those organisms that use a ball, we could then split them up into those that have a solid ball and some that have an inflatable ball. So, for instance, sports that use a solid ball would include billiards and would include baseball. Whereas for those that use an inflatable ball, some of them are round and some of them are oblong. We could further classify those. The round ones would include things like soccer and volleyball. The oblong ones would include football and rugby. Now, if we look at those sports that do not use a ball, we could classify those into the running sports and the fighting sports. And in the running sports, we could further break those down into those that run for a short distance, those that run for a long distance. And the fighting sports we could classify as those that are for striking and those that have grappling. We could further break these down then. The short distance could be the 50-meter dash and the 100-meter dash. Long distance could be marathons and ultramarathons. The fighting sports for the striking styles could include boxing, could include karate, taekwondo. The grappling sports we could further break down into judo and jiu-jitsu. Okay, so just as we classify things like sports, by the way, I left out a lot of sports, so if I forgot your favorite one, don't be mad at me. But just like we can classify sports into hierarchies, the general moving down to the most specific, we can do the same thing with living things. So if we were to look at all living things, we would see that there are three main types of living things: the bacteria, the archaea, and the eukarya. So the term that we use for these three big buckets into which we put all other living things, we say there are three domains of living things. Okay, now, each one of these domains would be further broken down into different levels, and certainly we will be talking about many of those in this video today, which pertains to the Diversity of Life 1 lab for the class. But before we look at any of those lower levels, let's look at those three main domains. So when we classify organisms, we said all organisms are split up into the three groups that we call these domains. First group is the domain bacteria, or sometimes we call it the domain monera. These are extremely small organisms. In fact, we have to look at them under the microscope in order to see them. They're also unicellular, which means they're made up of only one cell. Now, there's three general shapes to these organisms in the domain bacteria. Some of them are going to be rod-shaped, and we say the general term for a rod-shaped bacteria is a bacillus. And kind of the classic example we use of bacilli are bacteria that belong to Escherichia coli or E. coli. These are bacteria that are commonly found in our large intestine, and they're really good as long as they're there. It's when they move out of the large intestine that there can be some problems associated with that. Okay, some bacteria are going to be spherical or sphere-shaped, and we call those cocci. And a very common coccus bacteria is called Staphylococcus aureus. Now, this particular bacteria is found fairly commonly on the skin, but there is a variety of Staphylococcus aureus that can be potential pathogen. It can cause skin infections and other types of infections. And maybe you've heard of MRSA, MRSA, which stands for methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. So there is a variety of Staph aureus that can cause disease that has genes that give it resistance to a very powerful antibiotic called methicillin. And the last bacterial shape that we're going to talk about here is called a spirillum, which is a spiral-shaped bacteria. And a spiral-shaped bacteria would include Treponema pallidum, which is the bacteria that is responsible for the disease syphilis. Now, that's not to say that all bacteria cause diseases, because they certainly don't, and we'll talk more about that in a little while. Okay, so what about these bacteria? What about these organisms in the domain bacteria? Well, some of them are autotrophs, and by autotrophs we mean they make their own food. Now, some of them are photosynthetic, and we would call those photoautotrophs. Some of those are chemosynthetic, and they're going to make food, they're going to make sugar using chemicals. Some bacteria are commensal or mutualistic. Commensal relationship means that they are involved with another organism, but they don't help or hurt that organism. Whereas a mutualistic relationship is where they're in a relationship with another organism and both organisms are going to benefit. So some examples of this would be E. coli, as I'd mentioned a little earlier, is really good for us when it lives in our large intestine because it makes a vitamin called vitamin K, which helps our blood to clot. There's also been some evidence recently to show that some bacteria living in and on our body actually produce chemicals that help us regulate our immune system. And sometimes we'll actually take supplements of those bacteria, and they're called probiotics. Some people like me just like it when those bacteria are added to dairy products, and it gives us things like yogurt here. And if you look, I took a picture of a yogurt that was in my refrigerator, and it says on the label it contains live and active cultures of Lactobacillus acidophilus and Lactobacillus bulgaricus and some other bacteria here. Some bacteria, as we said, are pathogens, and these are the ones that usually get more attention, but they are not the most common type of relationship bacteria have with humans. Many of the bacteria are free-living decomposers. Okay, so the domain archaea. Now, if you look at the word archaeology, which means the study of old human civilizations, archaeo means old. So the domain archaea represents bacteria-like organisms. And in fact, up until about 50 or 60 years ago, what we consider bacteria and archaeans were all lumped together into one group. But as we've learned more about the biochemistry of these organisms, we've found some of them are different enough from the bacteria that we're going to call them archaeans in the domain archaea. Like bacteria, they're unicellular, they are really, really small, but we tend to find these in really extreme environments. So sometimes they're called extremophiles, which means philios, to love, extreme conditions. So we find archaeans in the deep ocean vents at the bottom of the ocean. We find them below glaciers. We can even find them in hot springs. So here is a species called halobacteria that is found in really, really salty places. And then when I went to Yellowstone, about a year and a half or so ago, we went and visited some of the hot springs. And at Abyssal Pool, or Abyss Pool, it's so hot you can see it's giving off steam. So it's pretty close to the boiling point of water, 212 degrees Fahrenheit or 100 degrees Celsius. And as you can see, because of the different colors in here, there are archaeans that are able to live in water that is almost boiling. That's a pretty extreme environment. So organisms in the domain bacteria and the domain archaea are sometimes called prokaryotes. And if we break this word down, pro meaning before, karyote is from the Latin word karyon, which is nucleus. So the prokaryotes are those organisms that evolved before a nucleus. And a nucleus is a structure that we find in organisms that holds the DNA, helps protect it, keep it organized. So organisms in the domain bacteria and the domain archaea are prokaryotes because they evolved before nuclei did. Organisms in the domain eukarya are called eukaryotes, and the prefix eu means true, karyon meaning nucleus. So these are the organisms that have a true nucleus, and they're going to be everything that isn't a bacteria or archaean. So if we look at our hierarchy again here, we said we've got 3 domains, bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. Now, each one of these we could further split up into lower levels. And I'm going to be honest with you, most people don't need to know about the lower levels of bacteria and the lower levels of archaea. So we're going to focus a lot of our time on the different subcategories in the domain eukarya. Okay, and in fact, we're going to call the subdivision below domain a kingdom. And there are 4 kingdoms in the domain eukarya. Kingdom Protista, Kingdom Fungi, Kingdom Plantae, and Kingdom Animalia. Now guess what? We're also going to subdivide these layers, or these levels, and we will certainly talk about some of those as time goes on. So the domain eukarya represents anything, as I said before, that isn't bacteria or archaea, and it's divided into those 4 different kingdoms. So the kingdom Protista represents protozoa and algae. Kingdom Fungi, well, those are the fungi. That's a tough one. Kingdom Plantae represents the plants. Kingdom Animalia represents the animals. So we talked about domains, and we said the subdivisions of domains are kingdoms. Now, there's also subdivisions of kingdoms, and on and on. So let's talk about those a little bit. So we subdivide each classification level into groups of more similar organisms. So for example, in the kingdom Animalia, there are many different phyla, which is the plural form of phylum. So in the kingdom Animalia, some of the phyla that we will be talking about next week include the phylum Chordata. So these are animals that have a spinal cord, like the bullfrog or the trumpeter swans that you see there. Those are animals in the phylum Chordata. The phylum Arthropoda, these are the animals that have a hard external skeleton, and that's going to include animals like the longhorn beetle here, crabs and lobsters and crayfish are all animals in the phylum Arthropoda. And the phylum Porifera, these are the sponges, like, you know, that sponge that lives in a pineapple below the sea. Our favorite SpongeBob SquarePants. And there are other phyla too, again, that we will be talking about next week. So our levels of taxonomy include domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. Now, if your instructor, if it isn't me, is requiring that you know these levels of classification, and I suspect most of them will, a good way to remember these levels of classification is to use something called a mnemonic device. And a mnemonic device is where we come up with a silly sentence where the first letter of each word in the sentence is the same as the first word in the list that we're trying to remember. So my kind of G-rated mnemonic device for remembering the levels of taxonomy is Donna Karan, you know, the fashion designer, prefers to come over for great shopping. So the D in Donna is for domain, the K in Karen is for kingdom, and you can see the rest of it right here. Now I'm going to encourage you to stop the video here and take some time and practice this. But if you're a student in my class, be forewarned that this is a typical question that I ask about on the lab quizzes. So you want to make sure that you know this stuff. So, if we know the taxonomy of 2 or more organisms, this tells us an awful lot about the relationships between them. How similar are they, or how different are they? And I'm going to put up the taxonomies, the taxonomic levels of 5 different organisms. And I'm going to again ask you to pause the video and take a look to see if you can tell how similar or how different these organisms are. Okay, so please pause your video here and take a few minutes and take a look at them, and we'll talk about it when you restart the video. Okay, welcome back. So if we look, I put the levels of taxonomy off to the left here. So all of the organisms that we're talking about here are in the domain Eukarya. Of the kingdoms, well, 4 of these are in the kingdom Animalia, so it tells us that they're animals. 1 of them is in the kingdom Plantae. So that automatically tells us that this organism here, even if you don't know what Quercus rubra is, you already know this organism is going to be really different from these others because this is a plant and these are all animals. And in fact, as we'll see in a little while, Quercus rubra is going to be a red oak tree. Of these other organisms right here, phylum Chordata for these first 4, and phylum Arthropoda for this one right here. So this one is an arthropod. This is an animal with a hard external skeleton. So we know this one is going to be different from these other 3 animals here. That tells us a lot. Of these other animals that we see right here, they are all mammals. So they're warm-blooded and they have a 4-chambered heart. 3 of them are in the order Carnivora, so they're carnivorous animals. This one is a primate, so we know this one is going to be significantly different from these 3. Now, all 3 of these are in the family Canidae. That's the dog family. And if we look at this, Canis familiaris is the domestic dog. Canis lupus is the wolf. So because these 2 are in the same genus, even if you didn't know this was the domestic dog and this was the wolf, you would know that they were pretty similar because they are identical all the way down to genus and they are only different at the species level. This animal right here, Vulpes vulpes, is the red fox. So it's in the dog family, so it's similar to these, but because it's in a different genus, it's more different than these 2. And then this animal right here, Homo sapiens, if you're not already aware of that, is the scientific name for humans. Okay, so knowing about taxonomic levels tells us something about these organisms, even if we don't know what all these different names mean. And they are kind of difficult sometimes. So when we talk about the scientific name of an organism, we're talking about the genus and the species name together. For instance, when we talked about humans, we wrote the scientific name as Homo sapiens. Now note in this case that the word homo and sapiens are both underlined. That tells us that this is the scientific name. Or we could take the scientific name and put it in italics. Both writing the name either way like this tells us that we are looking at the scientific name of an organism. And in this video, when I put up scientific names, I will always italicize them to make them stand out. So a species, I want to talk about that just a little bit. So a species is a group of similar organisms that are able to reproduce with each other, but are not able to reproduce with other species. So let's talk in greater depth about kingdoms in the domain Eukarya. So kingdom Protista, these represent small organisms, but they're bigger than bacteria and they're going to have a true nucleus. They're unicellular, or some of them can be colonial, which means you have a bunch of them maybe living together, but they could be split apart pretty easily. But they are more complex than the bacteria are. And there are 2 main types of protists that we'll be talking about. You've got the algae, which are the plant-like protists that are able to do photosynthesis, like this beautiful algae right here, which is called Spirogyra. That's the genus name. And when you see SPP afterwards like this, means that we know the genus is Spirogyra. I don't know what the species is, but it's one of the species in this genus. And then we've got the protozoa, which are the animal-like protists that are not, for the most part, able to do photosynthesis, like Paramecium caudatum, which you see here. And these are both the Spirogyra and the Paramecium are critters that we could run across if we were looking at some of the freshwater ponds and lakes in Lake County. Kingdom Animalia, these are multicellular organisms made up of more than one cell. They are heterotrophs, so they are not able to manufacture their own food. They are going to depend on food that is made by other organisms. And some examples of animals include this spotted eagle ray, which I saw when I was snorkeling in Hawaii. This beautiful black swallowtail butterfly. This young white-tailed deer fawn. The red salamander here and the red-bellied woodpecker. I know it's got a red head, but there's another woodpecker called the red-headed woodpecker, which is different. So this is a red-bellied woodpecker. So we just talked a little bit about the protists and the animals. That's really going to be the focus of the lab for next week. So the remainder of the lab here, we're going to be focusing on the kingdom fungi and the kingdom plantae. So the kingdom fungi, these are unicellular organisms or multicellular, it just depends. Mainly they're decomposers and parasites. So some examples of a decomposer would be this inky cap mushroom, the really colorful chicken of the woods fungus, the white coral fungus that you see here. These are all decomposers. Here's a package of yeast that I took out of my pantry. This is also, I don't know if you'd consider it a decomposer, but it uses sugars in order for these unicellular organisms to grow. So they're more free living. But a parasitic fungus is this real nasty one. Belongs to the genus Cordyceps, which is a genus of parasitic fungi, and they parasitize all kinds of different things. Here you can see a wasp. So one fungal spore landed on this wasp, and the fungus started growing inside. It can actually change the behavior of the animal that it parasitizes. And when it finally killed the wasp, you can see it sprouting fruiting bodies out of the wasp. And the spores that you find on these fruiting bodies, if they land on another wasp, they will infect that wasp and cause this to continue. So pretty cool, nasty stuff. So there are 3 different phyla in the kingdom fungi that we're going to be talking about in this class. There are some more, but these are the ones that we're going to be focusing on. So the first phylum is Basidiomycota. So most of the mushrooms that we are familiar with are going to be in the phylum Basidiomycota. It's going to include the pizza mushroom, and the scientific name for that is Agaricus bisporus. What makes basidiomycetes unique is that they make spores, if you look at them under a microscope, that are club-shaped, or a club-shaped structure called a basidium. Zygomycota is the next phylum of fungi, and these are going to produce special spores called zygospores. And some examples of zygomycetes would include bread mold, and then some that we would find both on land and living in the water. And then the last phylum of the fungi is going to be Ascomycota. And the ascomycetes are going to have a special spore-bearing cell called an ascus, which again, you'd have to really look at under a microscope in order to see. Most of them are terrestrial or parasitic. But a really pretty one that we see in Lake County includes this red cup fungus. And these are relatively small. They'd be about a ½ inch wide or smaller. But when you're walking around in the forest and you see them, they're really bright orangey red. They really stand out. Some other examples of ascomycetes include the mold that is responsible for making the drug penicillin, which is Penicillium notatum. And baker's yeast is also an ascomycete. Now, an interesting thing is something called a lichen. And lichens are a mutualistic relationship between a fungus and an algae. And as I mentioned before, mutualistic means that both organisms are going to benefit. So in this case, the fungus is going to be living on the land, and it's going to provide a watery environment in which the algae are going to be able to grow. So the fungus helps the algae by providing this watery environment because algae have to live in water. The algae are going to be able to do photosynthesis, and as a result produce food, produce sugars for the algae as well as the fungi. And here you can see a rock that I ran across in Virginia hiking around, and this has a whole bunch of different types of lichens growing on it. You've got some crustose, some crusty ones, and some foliose, some growing like plants. You've got some purple ones, a variety of different green ones, really interesting. And then here's a lichen that I found growing in the bark of a maple tree. Okay, so lichens, mutualistic relationship between an algae and a fungus. All right, this brings us to the kingdom fungi, or excuse me, the kingdom plantae. Kingdom plantae is made up of multicellular organisms, most of which are autotrophs. They're going to do photosynthesis to produce food. There are a few examples of parasitic plants, but in that case they just parasitize other plants. There is a really good video from the Amoeba Sisters, and I will put a link in the PowerPoint presentation, and if I put it in YouTube, I'll try to put it in YouTube. I do strongly encourage you. It's just a 7 or 8 minute video, but it goes into classification of plants in such a way that it'll make it easy to understand. So some examples of plants would include this white water lily that you see here. Now this is kind of a cool picture. When I was out weeding my house in the spring, getting ready to put in a garden, some squirrel had buried an acorn, which is the seed of an oak tree, and it had germinated. And when I was pulling it up, I pulled up the stem, the leaves, the root, and even part of the acorn, which you can see here, which is pretty cool. This is a real pretty flower. It's a type of an orchid called pink lady slipper orchid. And then this is another common Lake County flower, if you know where to look, called Jack in the Pulpit. So all of these are examples of plants. Now, when we're identifying plants or organisms in the kingdom plantae, a few things that you want to be looking for. You want to ask yourself, does it have vascular tissue? Now, vascular tissue represents a series of tubes. Some of the tubes are going to be able to take water from the roots and bring it up to the stems and the leaves, and that's called xylem. Other tubes are going to be going from the leaves, traveling down through the stem to the roots, and that is called phloem. Plants that have this vascular tissue, the xylem and the phloem, are able to grow really big. Okay? If you don't, however, have these tubes, the plants tend to be really small because diffusion is what it would take in order to move the water and the nutrients, and diffusion isn't really good for moving through the thick tissue of a plant. So you want to look to see if it has vascular tissue. You want to ask yourself, how does this plant reproduce? And then what do the reproductive structures look like? So the first type of plants we're going to talk about are called the non-vascular plants. And the non-vascular plants are going to include things like bryophytes and liverworts. And these are going to, again, be lacking vascular tissue. They're going to be lacking these tubes for moving water and nutrients, and as a result, they're going to have to stay pretty small. They're also not going to have roots, stems, and true leaves. And these plants, like the next group that we're going to talk about, are going to reproduce with spores. Now, a spore is a really, really small structure. It's smaller than seeds, and it's not going to have any nutrients for the embryonic plant. And essentially, it's going to be a single cell with your embryonic plant. So spores are going to need to, in most cases, land someplace where there's plenty of water to allow this single cell to start growing and doing the stuff that it needs to do. So here's a picture I took when I was hiking in the Appalachian Trail of a salamander. This is a Desmognathus salamander growing on moss. Now, this salamander was probably about 2 to 3 inches long. So that gives you an idea of how small these mosses really are. Now, another example of a moss, and I took this picture in right on the border of Lake and McHenry counties at Volo Bog, this plant might grow an inch, maybe 2 inches tall. And again, because they don't have this vascular tissue, they tend to be really, really small. So the next type of plant is what we call the seedless vascular plant. Now, as with the non-vascular plants, these plants are going to reproduce with spores, not seeds. But in this case, they're going to contain vascular tissue that can allow them to grow bigger than the non-vascular plants. And there's two that I want to talk about real briefly here. First of which are the club mosses. And here's a nice example of a club moss, sometimes also called a ground pine. And I made this mistake myself. When I saw it for the first time, it looked like a teeny tiny little pine tree. But the pine trees reproduce with seeds, and the club mosses are going to reproduce with spores. And pines can grow really, really big. This particular club moss won't grow bigger than 4 or 5 inches. And then the other example are going to be the ferns. And here you see something called a fiddlehead, which looks like the top of a fiddle or a violin by where you would tighten up the strings. Here is a adult version of a fern. This particular one is interesting. It's called the cinnamon fern. And whereas most ferns would have their spores on the underside of the leaves, in this case, cinnamon ferns have their spores stored in these kind of orangey brown structures that you see right there. But these have vascular tissue so they can grow quite a bit taller, and they're fossilized ferns that are 10 and 12 feet tall. So having that vascular tissue gives you a lot of flexibility in how big you can grow. But again, these plants are responsible for making spores and not seeds. So spores and seeds are both used for reproduction. Spores, as I mentioned before, are going to be single-celled, and they're going to be really, really small. And here you see Lycopodium, so the club moss that I just showed you a few moments ago, spores under a microscope. So these are so small you have to look at them under the microscope. Seeds, on the other hand, are going to be made up of many cells. They will have this little embryonic plant, and there's going to be food stored around it. So when you plant a seed, there's some nutrients in there that's going to allow the plant to start to grow, put down some roots, put down some stems, make some leaves before it can start making its own food. And here you can see some almond seeds, that one of which I cracked open, and didn't do real well, but there's the little embryonic almond tree right in there. And that picture of the acorn that had started to sprout again, you can see the food that was stored in the acorn here provided the energy for the cells to start growing and produce the leaves, the stem, and the root here. So many plants are going to be responsible for making seeds to reproduce, and there's two types that I would like to talk about. The gymnosperms, which are those plants that have naked seeds, in other words, they don't put a fruit around them, and the angiosperms, which are generally called the flowering plants. Gymnosperms, as I said before, their seeds are not going to be protected by a fruit, so they're quote-unquote naked. And these are going to include the plants that are the cone producers. So if you think of your pine and your spruce and your fir trees, and they're going to have cones like this beautiful ponderosa pine, Pacific ponderosa pine cone that you see here. And this particular one is also going to have needles for leaves. And many gymnosperms, not all of them, but many gymnosperms are going to have these leaves that are modified into needles. These are going to help resist freezing, so it'll allow them to continue to do photosynthesis in the wintertime. Although there are a few species of gymnosperms that make needles for leaves that shed them every year, and a real good example is one we see at Volo Bog. That's called the tamarack tree. These actually shed their needles in the fall, and they grow new ones in the spring. The angiosperms, these are the flowering plants, and these are going to produce seeds that are surrounded by a fruit. That fruit is going to help protect the seed, and it may play a role, depending on the plant, in helping to distribute the seeds. Because you don't want to have, if you're an oak tree, you don't want to release all of your acorns down at the base of your tree, because as those acorns grow up, they're going to be competing for sunlight and other resources with the parent plant. So some nice examples of angiosperms that we would see in Lake County include the cup plant that you see flowering here, the swamp milkweed plant, and the prairie shooting star. And these were all found hiking around Lake County. And then one growing in my garden is one of my favorites is the clematis flower here. So flowers are important for plants because they're going to be used in sexual reproduction. And if you remember what sexual reproduction is, that's where we're going to take, in the case of animals, we would be saying sperm and egg. In the case of plants, we would say pollen, which is essentially plant sperm and egg, each of which is going to have half of the genetic information. And we've got to get it so that these two cells can fuse together and have a fertilized embryo, which can grow into, in this case, a new plant. So how are we going to get the pollen cells and the egg cells together? Some plants are going to have the pollen and the egg in different parts of the flower. Some plants are going to have just male flowers that produce pollen and just female flowers that produce the eggs. So how are we going to get those two together? Well, some animals are going to use bright colors and nectar to attract pollinators, like bees, or in this case, the eastern tiger swallowtail butterfly that's on a thistle plant, or hummingbirds. These are my favorites. I've got hummingbird feeders in my backyard. So plants are going to expend energy to make nectar that's going to attract these pollinators. And as the pollinators come along to take the nectar and feed themselves, some of the pollen is going to brush up on their body. And when the pollinator flies over to another flower to get more nectar, it drops that pollen off, and as a result, we've transferred the pollen so that sexual reproduction can occur. It will be important for you to know the different parts of a flower. There is a good video that talks about the different parts. It's another one of the Amoeba Sisters video, and I will be posting a link to it. I do encourage you to watch that. This is another 7 or 8 minute video, but they're going to do a way better job of explaining it than I'm going to do it in the few seconds that I take here. So here you see a typical flower. We've got things like the petals, which we said again are often brightly colored and going to be used for attracting pollinators. We have these modified leaves that are going to help protect the flower when it's still a bud, called a sepal. And then we've got the male and female parts of the flower, which you in this case find in the same flower. So the stamen, and notice it has the word men in it, so this is kind of a nice way of remembering that this is the male portion of the plant that's going to make the pollen. The stamen is made up of the anther, which is where the pollen is made and stored, and the filament, which is going to be suspending the anther up off of the rest of the flower. And then we've got the pistil, which is the female part of the flower, and it's made up of the stigma. So think of the sticky stigma, because there's the stuff on the surface here that's sticky, so when pollen lands on it, it doesn't blow away. The style, which is the long tube, which is going to connect the stigma with the ovary in here. And if fertilization happens, if pollen lands on the sticky stigma and it travels down the style and it fertilizes an egg cell in the ovary, you will see the embryonic seed in here, and this can actually grow into the fruit from the ovary. Okay, I would encourage you to take a few minutes to stop the video and go through this, and or take some time and look at the Amoeba Sisters video and the links. So seeds are going to be spread a number of different ways. Some seeds are spread by wind, and probably the classic example that we know around in this area are going to be the dandelions. So a puff of wind comes along and it's going to blow the seeds away, and the little fuzzy part on top is going to allow that to be blown by the wind some distance from the parent plant. Some plants are going to be spread by water, and classic example of this would be the coconut. So coconut palms grow on the shores of oceans. If the coconut lands in the water, it can float for hundreds or thousands of miles away until when it reaches land, it can sprout into a new coconut tree. Some plants spread their seeds with the help of animals, and that's why if you've ever come across a cocklebur walking around in a prairie, the little hooks on the cocklebur here catch on fur, they catch on clothing, and they are carried away. And when an animal picks it off and throws it away, hey, you've just spread the seeds of the cocklebur. Interestingly, the little hooks that you find on here was actually part of the idea for Velcro. Another good example of animal spreading seeds are those with tasty fruits. So if an animal comes along and eats a cherry or an apple or a peach, as they're walking and eating, they're moving away from the parent plant, and when they get to the part that they can't eat, before we knew to dispose of or to compost these things properly, you throw them down. If they landed in a good place, they would germinate into a new plant, and thus animals were helping to spread the seeds of these plants. So there are two major types of flowering plants, or angiosperms. The first of which are called the monocots. And if you look at the prefix mono, mono means one. So monocots are plants that have one cotyledon, or one seed leaf, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Actually, I'll show you a picture. So corn is a really good example of a monocot, because if you take a corn kernel and you try to squeeze it, you can't get it to split apart. It is only one seed leaf, or one cotyledon, and food is stored in there for the embryonic plant. Okay, and contrast this with the dicots. Prefix di means two. So the dicots have two cotyledons, like the almond that you see here from earlier, that you can squeeze it the right way, it splits apart, and you have the two cotyledons or seed leaves and the embryonic almond tree that you see right there. So the monocots have one cotyledon or seed leaf. Some other characteristics of monocots is they have flower parts in threes or multiples of threes. So they might be in threes or sixes or nines or 12s. And a really pretty example of a monocot that we have in Lake County is this large flowered trillium. And as you can see, it has 3 petals, 3 sepals. In fact, the name trillium comes from the fact that it has 3 of these structures. And it has 3 stamina, 3 stamens here, or excuse me, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So flower parts in a multiple of 3, or 3s are multiple parts of 3s. And although it's kind of hard to see on the trillium here, oftentimes the leaves have veins that run parallel to one another. And if we look at the stems under a microscope, the vascular bundles, the tubes, the xylem and the phloem, would be kind of scattered around. So this is probably a grass leaf or something similar to it. So the veins would be running parallel to one another in that case. And here you can see the stem under the microscope, and you can see the vascular bundles. They kind of look like Spider-Man, if you ask me. The vascular bundles are kind of scattered around in the stem. Now, contrasting the monocots, we have the dicots. And the dicots are going to have 2 cotyledons or seed leaves. They're going to also have flower parts in 4s or 5s, or multiples of 4s or 5s. So in this picture of a common blue violet that I found in my backyard a few years ago, you can see it has 5 petals. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. It's also going to have leaf veins that are net-like as opposed to being parallel like they were in the monocots. And the vascular bundles are going to be found in a ring. So here we can kind of summarize. You're going to have 2 cotyledons. The veins are going to not be parallel. And in this cross-section through a stem, it's not even magnified with a microscope. You can see the vascular bundle is going to be in a ring here. And this is a monocot and dicot next to one another. So that's all I have for this lab today. Next week, we're going to be talking about the Diversity of Life 2 lab and looking in particular at the Kingdom Protista and Kingdom Animalia, and this gorgeous picture I took a few years ago showing an American bald eagle with a freshwater drum in its talons. Thanks for your hard work. Thanks for paying attention. Take care of yourselves, and we'll see you around.